In today's presentation, we're going to talk about how we can use agentic automation to automate our low-line credit application process. In this demonstration, the customer is going to apply for a credit card. However, they are going to miss key financial information. So the bank is going to ask the customer to provide a proof of income in the form of a pay stub. Once UiPath receives that proof of income, it's going to trigger a series of downstream automations and agents that begin processing the application. Most importantly, once the agent comes to its conclusion, it's going to ask a human analyst to review the findings before contacting or processing the application. And then we'll see how we can constantly monitor and optimize this process using the UiPath platform. Here is the email that I received from the bank asking me to provide additional information. In this case, I need to attach a pay stub. I'm going to go ahead and reply directly to this email. I'll attach the pay stub and then I will respond back to the bank correspondence. Once the email is received, it's going to kick off a series of downstream automations and agents. In this case, the first step is taking the documents in, reading information from the pay stub, and handing it back over to a third-party agent. In this case, the third-party agent is an AWS Strand agent that we configured and deployed within the UiPath environment. One thing I call out, even though the UiPath is executing the AWS agent, we still have a robust audit log of what the agent is completing as part of its process. Here is an example of the audit log that's coming from the AWS agent. Once the AWS agent completes its run, it's going to trigger a series of robotic process automations, as well as other third-party agents to review internal sources of information, understand the report from the credit bureau, and calculate debt-to-income ratios, all in the context of the loan application. Once the three parallel activities finish completing, the concatenated information is sent to the UiPath native agent to understand the application and provide lending recommendations. Let's take a minute to dive deeper into the lending recommendation agent that we created in the UiPath environment. Here's the example of the prompt that I used to configure the agent. One thing I want to mention is how we're able to use the UiPath low-code development environments to guide the creation of our agents according to the best practices across the industry. In this example, my agent has a score of 74, and then I can break into the individual components of the agent and see how I can improve the performance of the agent based off the feedback from the large language model. Here you can see the side-by-side suggestions of how I can improve the prompts of the agent before deploying to production. In this case, I'll just cancel and continue. In addition to a guided experience to define the prompts themselves, we can also define guardrails to make sure our agents are not performing actions in any of our downstream systems without our direct knowledge. In order to accomplish this, we have tools configured for each of our agents. On each tool call, we can add a set of guardrails to the agents to prevent any unintentional or malicious behavior. In this example, I can have the guardrail enforced on every output that the tool is making. In this case, with the example of the credit card, I can add a value that's saying if the credit line being applied for is over 10,000, I want the agent to immediately block that transaction and continue with the exception handling process. Another important element of these agentic solutions is how we're able to track and monitor the performance of the agents in real time. In order to accomplish that, I'm able to define evaluation sets. These evaluation sets are inputs that I define and pair with an expected output. This gives me an intuitive and easy read to score how well the model is performing and how it could potentially be drifting over time as I continue to process these applications. The last piece I'll just quickly mention is that this agent is deployed in the context of a much longer running process. I showed you the example of the Venn diagram. That is just one component of a series of automations that I'm configuring in the context and deploying as a single unified project for this agent. Let's go back to the runtime version of this process and see how our credit analyst is able to interact with the output of the agent. Here is the sample validation experience I created for the credit analyst. We'll see the agent analysis on the left-hand side and whether or not the agent recommends approving the applicant John Doe for the corresponding line of credit. In addition, I'll see the information that John Doe included as part of his application. One being the pay stub he submitted, the other being the bank statement or ID card that he included as part of his application. In addition to using the back office agents, we can also provide the analyst a conversational agent that we can ask real-time questions. I can ask the agent what the high limit for credit utilization is. This conversational agent will go out to the enterprise context and generate an up-to-date result based off the documentation I provide. This prevents the human analyst from going and opening up these different policies and finding the correct information. The conversational agent is going to summarize that based off the enterprise context and provide attributions or references to all the different points it's pulling from that loan documentation I provided in my context. Once the analyst has an adequate understanding of John Doe's application and all of the different policies within the bank, we can continue to deny or reject the application and proceed with the remaining workflow. Once the credit analyst submits that task, it will go on to create the adverse action notice, generate the email response, and combine or attach the letter that we created for the notice, and then proceed to contact and email the customer the results of the findings. Here's an example of the email that the agent generated to send back to the customer, informing them that they were declined the line of credit. In addition to providing the reasoning, it also went ahead and generated the adverse action notice that is required. Let's take a step back. This is an example of how we can process a single application. At an institution your size, you're going to process thousands, tens of thousands, even millions of these applications in a given time period. UiPath is not only going to orchestrate the robots and the humans and the automations for that individual run, but be able to do it across those millions of transactions that you have every year. Here is an example of how we can gain telemetry from the process information that we track at the runtime of these automations and agent workflows. In this example, I can quickly see what parts of the process are the most time-consuming or the potential bottlenecks in the process, and I have the telemetry to support any of my findings. I can also take one step deeper and check this process for conformance and see our automation rate and how well this process is performing at runtime. To conclude and to summarize, we saw how we can use agentic automation to automate our low-line credit card application process. In this case, we used UiPath to orchestrate a series of robots, agents, and people to ultimately provide the credit analyst all the information the human needs to make the decision whether or not John Doe was eligible for that particular line of credit. And then we saw how we can use technology in the runtime information to continuously monitor and optimize the process on an ongoing basis.